this point. Thanks everyone for attending this week. The CLM, I'll be presenting this week. Let me get up the slides here. There you go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Excellent. So by way of background is, even though I'm in my second year of the PhD, I am doing my quals a little bit late. And the way that WPI does quals is they allow you to, the qualifiers is to take an existing model and refine it, or take a qualitative theory and that's never been simulated and simulated it. So since I'm coming this a little bit late in the game, I decided to take, and my interest is in violence and instability, I propose to take a current debate in counterterrorism between two experts, Sageman and Hoffman, and see if I could add anything to the debate. And I basically started, I guess, 3 weeks ago with the topic that I'll go through. Had 2 weeks to complete all my material, submit it, and then a week later today I did the orals defense for 2 hours, and spoiler alert, I passed. So you feel free to criticize anything, I don't care, it's already passed. But no, so what we'll do, the feedback I'm looking for today is I actually want this work to continue and maybe see if I can move it into an article shape or find something from it to turn into an article, make some use out of it. I think it's very interesting. It dovetails nicely. My past work was on emerging state actors and sort of insurgencies at the non-state actor level. This is much more individualized, like what happens in individual radicalization. So I've got quite a few slides. Feel free to stop me at any point. This is very early stage work. This represents the first presentation of this after what is essentially a 2-week effort. So I expect there to be a lot of errors and opportunities, and that's why I'm looking for feedback. So what is the Sageman Hoffman? By the way, I'm losing my voice, and this is the 3rd hour I've been talking today. So if I lose it in the midway, I'll have Shia step in and just make up stuff. What is the Sageman Hoffman debate? This is a debate between two leading experts in the counterterrorism field that emerged around 2008. Both had published very influential books in the field. Bruce Hoffman is sort of a historian, RAND researcher, Georgetown University type guy, very well known in the field. He'd been publishing for 20 years. He sort of had a theory about why terrorism occurred. Mark Sageman was a new entrant who was a former CIA operations officer. He brought more of a psychiatry and sociologist aspect. And he published a book in 2008 that presented a very different view of how terrorist radicalization occurs. And Hoffman took the opportunity to kind of write a Facebook screed against, I shouldn't say that, it was a critique, but it was a very sharply worded critique that was published in Foreign Affairs, who gave Sageman the opportunity to respond. Sageman responded, Hoffman responded. They both went after each other. And what happened was this debate actually split the counter-terrorist community into two camps based on which side of the debate they fell on. And Hoffman was considered to have won because one of the aspects of the debate is whether, you know, Al-Qaeda mattered anymore, and history has shown that it does. But there's a real question when it comes to the processes of radicalization is who was right and who was wrong. And when you look at what they're disagreeing at, this is a high-level summary. The key part I focused on was the radicalization of terrorists. And they specifically were looking at Salafi takfiri, which is a term I use that is, that the US military uses that identifies these are people with a Salafi ideology generally, but they have taken upon themselves to commit violent acts, terrorist acts, they operate outside the Ummah, and so they're kind of been declared takfiri, and these groups include Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, most of the terrorist groups we'd associate that are not Shia related. And so Sageman and Hoffman were both focusing on this very specific group, but I think there may be a generic structure here for terrorism in general, like right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, separatist. Sageman's hypothesis was that radicalization emerges from local conditions, and it's done through this informal self-activating networks that are connected by the internet. So his approach has been called the swarm. It emerges from the bottom up. Hoffman says, no, it's a foreign organization like an Al-Qaeda or an ISIS that identifies and facilitates the recruitment of candidates from afar. So they may have individuals going to social networks, it may be online recruiting, but there's a very distinct organization. This doesn't just happen. Some group is out there that is trying to make it happen. So from this, they both diverge on what the big threat to the homeland is. They both agreed in principle that, you know, all these things mattered, but they really disagreed on what was the primary threat. Sageman said it was homegrown terrorism. Hoffman said it was Al-Qaeda. Methodological approach, they had different methods. Sageman took a psychology and motivations perspective. where Hoffman looked at processes of organized actors. They disagreed on what to do about this. You know, Sageman said there's very little value in killing Al-Qaeda leaders. Hoffman said that had a value. And the preferred policy of Sageman was minimal military action overseas, while the majority of resources should be focused in the local community, policing to sort of identify and disable local networks. Hoffman had a much more active military and intelligence work abroad to disrupt foreign terrorist organizations so they are not engaging in recruitment and planning opportunities. There we go. So at the beginning of the 2 weeks, I proposed kind of a dynamic standard method. I would establish behavior modes of each author's underlying theories. These would be as very simple dynamic hypotheses, causal loop diagrams. I wasn't going to simulate each author independently. I only had 2 weeks. I would discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the mental models. I would then see if there's a synthesis where Sageman and Hoffman may be arguing different ends of a spectrum of behavior. So the question is, are they really arguing opposite things, or are they arguing different manifestations of the same system? A system can operate in both swarm and in fisherman. I was going to create a synthesis causal loop diagram, numerically simulate that, and see what we could learn under what contingencies different behaviors arise. There is a paper that goes with this. It's a very rough draft paper, but it is available if people want. It's got additional charts and information and all that in there. This was the behavior mode that was available to at the time. Both of them were writing in 2005, 2006, 2007, and they were reacting to this sharp increase. On the left-hand side is the number of Salifi Takfiri incidents in the US and Western Europe. It excludes 9/11. On the right-hand side is the casualties, which is the deaths in blue and wounded in red. So you can see there's a very large spike in 2004, 2005, and I think that's the environment they were reacting to. Now, all my data in this report, Sageman never published his data set. Hoffman did, but my data actually comes from a third party called the Global Terrorism Database, which is out of the University of Michigan. So I wanted to use a third party sort of credible actor for the data set. So they both see that there's a large rise, and the question is, what causes this rise? Is it local conditions? Is it unaffiliated lone wolves, or is it more sort of cells and people connected to major terrorist organizations? So I tried to authentically replicate Sageman's hypothesis as a causal loop diagram, and in the paper, which associates with this, I go through and sort of build the loops individually. But in the Sageman hypothesis, he says radicalization occurs as a result of moral outrage and personal resonance, and that is, you see suffering that is caused by human actions. It's not just by accident. It's not an act of nature. It's not just systemic corruption. It's something that, like unarmed man getting shot, or a drone strike that kills a family by accident. There's an intentional act that generates moral outrage, and the more personal resonance you have with it, the more this seems to resonate with your own experience, the deeper that outrage is felt. He proposed that people who, under certain conditions, adapted this narrative to explain this. So this is not all people, but some people took this as a narrative of what he called the war on Islam. If this were a generic structure, that might just be the narrative, but it's a worldview that explains these causes of the suffering. And the people who took this war on Islam view, then a subset further of them tended to identify as warriors. And what I mean by that is they sort of had the warrior myth of themselves. They were heroes in their own story. They were going to violently intercede on behalf and protect someone, or they were going to attack the Crusader countries or the Zionists, or they would take some sort of forceful action, because obviously you can be morally outraged, you can view that there's persecution of Islam and not ever get to terrorism. But he said his theory was, as people get radicalized, they begin to get this warrior identity, and it creates this pool of self-similar individuals. These self-similar individuals share a variety of societal and demographic characteristics. That's all in the paper. They have a certain age, education, background, socioeconomic. So it's a very small group of people within a larger country, or even within a larger community. But within that pool of self-similar individuals, they begin radicalizing at a rate of mobilization to commit terror acts. Now, the rate of mobilization is actually a call out to a structure you'll see down here, which looks at online and offline networks. Online networks are internet chat forums, email, social media. Offline is everything from petty criminal gangs to youth groups, soccer teams, things around the neighborhood that are informal offline social networks. And this sort of four-leaf clover diagram shows it's a success to the successful archetype between radicalization that occurs, radicalization and moderation. So the moderation is red. The system will tend to become path dependent and veer. The more radicalization it has, it's reinforcing like the success to the successful, the more radicalization you'll get. Whereas if you have more moderation, it'll tend to pull back. Sageman went into a much more detailed analysis of these networks.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Tim. What's the difference between green and red colors here?
Green are radicalization networks. Red are moderating networks.
And all of these causal links are coming from Sageman kind of hypothesis, or you add anything to them?
Yes. This is me. He didn't model them in causal loops, obviously.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, this is me pulling from his literature, and the paper goes through and kind of explains it with the citation. But these are trying to use his terms and his description of reinforcing behavior to generate what's a positive versus a negative loop, etc.
Okay.
Yeah. So he went into a lot of detail that I began mapping out of how this radicalization works. For example, when you have self-selecting echo chambers online, if people are being very aggressive or hostile or ideological, moderate people will leave. But because it's not known they leave, there's no big notification, there becomes this illusion of numbers that everyone you're surrounded with starts to is acting in the same way. He also talked about how in your social networks, there is mutual group reinforcement. If you hung out with the same group for soccer and you guys kind of had a little youth gang going on and maybe you went to the same school, these things began overlapping and clustering. And the more clustering you had, the greater cohesion, which means you were more reluctant to abandon, because it wouldn't just be meaning abandoning the cause, you'd be abandoning your friends, your social network, and this created a reduction. The problem is, as I mapped all of these out, they're all positive feedback loops. So it really is, it's simplified down to this structure here. You can get more detail, but it's really a success to the successful. Two positive feedback loops are interacting, and the gain of the system is determined by which one's more prevalent and radicalized, or is it more moderation or radicalization? Once they commit terror acts, Sageman hypothesized that we had a military or a law enforcement response, which created global and local grievances as a byproduct that led to moral outrage. So this was the growth loop. And he described limits as being societal response limits. So there were societal and demographic limits. And I go into these in the paper, but they're basically latent supports that keeps the population of potential individuals high, constraints that keeps it from going too high, like he had the age demographics and the education and stuff. So these are basically, this is a growth cycle, and this one was the limits to growth cycle. To be clear, his growth dynamics were far more clear, articulate, and well argued. His limits were fairly large and vague and sort of, simplistic. He described Europe would be more susceptible to terrorism because there's no American dream for people to buy into. They were kind of, they were valid, but they weren't super well articulated. I added two other limiting effects that obviously when you commit terrorism, you're killed or captured, or you might moderate from a radicalized position and sort of remove yourself from radicalization. So this is what Sageman was arguing in a qualitative way, was sort of the swarm hypothesis. You don't need a terrorist organization. All you need is things going on in the world that are perceived locally, and these sort of networks can be entirely local. So there's no foreign terrorist organization. There's no need for one to create the threat of terrorism. So Hoffman actually had a very similar radicalization in this inner loop. He used different terms, but he had the same sort of four-step process, so I kept it the same. So this is the same as Sageman here in terms. He used different words, but it was very similar. But the key thing for Hoffman is that what's fueling these things is a terrorist organization that is both broadcasting and narrowcasting content and information out, so that, where do you get your outrage and personal resonance? You get it from broadcasting and terrorist organizations. Where do you get the narrative that there's a war on Islam? That's propaganda. Narrowcasting is when a fighter in Syria, for example, does tweeting or engages with individual followers and tries to get them on this warrior identity. Hey, join the fight, join the cause. Mujahideen films come when there's a conflict zone, and it's no longer just lecturing on the thing. You actually can show images of vehicles being blown up or bombs striking civilians or anything tactical advice. And so all of this stuff sort of originates from conflict zones and terrorist organizations that exploit them to fuel the radicalization. So Hoffman doesn't disagree with the personal process of radicalization, but he says the way you stop it is you actually go and you do an intervention that eliminates the safe haven that reduces the terrorist organization, and that's how you'll create the limits here. He also brought up that you can have domestic radicals join the Mujahideen to go to a conflict zone, and that's where he stopped. I actually added in that if they go overseas to fight, they're going to probably come back. And so the return of the Mujahideen here, this ends up being a shifting the burden archetype, which should be familiar to folks. It's when you kind of push the problem off somewhere else, but it comes back to you. And I felt that this intervention, there is a very well-established theory called accidental guerrilla by Kukulin, which is when you do a military intervention, you potentially create enemies where there weren't any before because you over-respond, you have just the nature of conflict. And so this becomes a fixes that fail archetype. That doesn't mean he's wrong. It's just that sort of filling out the loop to make sure they made sense. This is a fixes that fail archetype. He had the experienced fighters. He said those were the ones coming back into the social groups that were the most dangerous. They were reconnecting with old friends and sort of had the cachet of military experience and sort of overseas luster. And he was key to point out that the web content that's coming from the foreign terrorist organizations has a huge influence on online interactions. So Hoffman's hypothesis very clearly is all about if you can eliminate terrorist organization, that cuts a lot of the links that fuels this. So this is where both of them sort of were at. What I then did is take a look at the data by extending the data set to 1995 to 2016. So now I'm looking at more data than they had. And what these charts are is on the left is Western Europe, on the right is US, and it's segmented by type of terrorism: anti-government, anti-Semitic, criminal, hate crime, left-wing, right-wing, Salafi, Takfiri, separatist, and unknown. And these are incident counts. So these are frequency of incidents and the number of incidents. And you can kind of see in Europe, far and away, the most common instance, this is separatist here, this brown. This light blue here is left-wing. This little bit of dark blue here and up here is actually Salafi, Takfiri, things that you could associate with Al-Qaeda or ISIS. In the US, it was more a little bit of left-wing terrorism here, but more recently right-wing terrorism had really taken off. But again, you have Salafi, Takfiri, not really a major contributor in the frequency of incidents, but you know, they're there. However, when you look at the lethality, so these are all incidents, you know, a terrorist act could be a property damage, vandalism, but when you look at lethality, this is a casualty. So the blue is deaths and red is wounded. And again, Western Europe on the left, US on the right. And you can clearly see here that the Salafi Takfiri are the most lethal source of terrorism in Western Europe by a lot. On the right, it actually is right-wing terrorism, but that's because I excluded 9/11. So none of this data includes 9/11 because it's such a distortive sort of one-day exceptional event that it would throw off the trends. But even with 9/11 excluded, you can say, okay, right-wing terrorism is more prevalent, but clearly Salafi Takfiri is a number two, and it's 9/11 did happen. So you can't just sort of remove that. But it does show that there is a reason to be concerned about this because the lethality is different, is much more severe with Salafi Takfiri terrorism. I then went and actually did a fractal segmentation. See, the problem these guys had with the data is they combined Western Europe and the US together, didn't distinguish really, you know, and kind of made their arguments from that. I actually split it by region and then split it again by terrorists that were either affiliated with a known network or were not. And so the GTD data set says there's an affiliation if there is they have a criteria that says these guys were actively working with a foreign terrorist organization. It's not just enough they say on Facebook, you know, the day of. There's got to be some evidence of interaction. Unaffiliated might be a lone wolf radical who is sympathetic to ISIS but has no connection. So this is where things got really interesting. And this is where I'm no longer modeling Sageman and Hoffman. I'm starting to expand it. It turns out both are right. When you segment the data this way, In Western Europe, the affiliated terrorist incidents are higher by number and much more lethal by average casualties. So in Western Europe, the Hoffman hypothesis is correct. It's a fisherman model. You know, a foreign terrorist organization is clearly the primary threat. In the United States, however, it's the exact opposite. In the United States, the unaffiliated terrorists are far more incidents and also more lethal per incident. So in the United States, it's the swarm hypothesis that's correct. So Hoffman's correct in Europe, Sageman's correct in the US. And what's interesting is they were both arguing that they were completely correct across the board and not recognizing sort of that there might be this type of split. So I think this is at least a notional proof point that you could be talking about different manifestations of the same system. The same underlying structure can determine if a system's in a fisherman or a swarm state. And I went about trying to create that. Questions so far?
Having fun.
Okay.
So you basically want to develop a model with different with this kind of same structure, but under some circumstances, one particular or a set of particular loops will become dominant, and in other kind of circumstances, other set of feedback loops become dominant. Is that what you want to do?
It's what I did. That's exactly what I did. So the next.
You did, so you have a simulation model?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. So, but you're right along the line of thinking. So the first thing I did is kind of smush their two hypotheses together into one causal loop diagram. And there's really nothing new here other than I've included all the elements. There's limits to growth, it's societal and demographic. There's the role of foreign terrorist organizations, there's still the four-leaf clover. So it's just a combined CLD that represents now both Sageman and Hoffman. I then built a system dynamics model, which I'll go over here in a quick bit. This is the overview. There's 4 sectors. I hid all the time delays and sort of parameter details. So those are hidden. So the limits to growth sector is a very simple supply chain here of you have a pool of self-similar individuals, and it grows at a demographic rate. So you basically have people that age into this population, and then they age out. And when I say self-similar individuals, Hoffman and Sageman go into a lot of socioeconomic, behavioral type distinctions, and that is the people who fit that criteria. So this is not saying that this is all Muslims of a certain age in the country, or all Muslims, or all males. It's literally saying amongst all of these criteria, this is the pool in that country. And this is a very generic model. So this number is just set arbitrarily at 10,000. It could be Indonesia, it could be the US. It's very generic. It's designed to be a generic model to explore the hypothesis. It's not calibrated to anything. From the pool of self-similar individuals, there will be a rate of mobilization at which they'll activate and radicalize. And the radicalized can either leave to fight overseas or come back, or they attempt terrorism. When they attempt terrorism, there are terrorist incidents. The terrorism casualties are produced here. This then creates you've got a drifting goal structure here, which has a current perception of terrorism, which is based off the current lethality compared to an anchor perception. So the normal of this model, the equilibrium, is we have 10,000 potential self-similar individuals in the pool, 1,000 radicalized, so 11,000 between them. They're doing a certain, I think, two incidents a month at 20 casualties, and that's what perception is equilibrium. You have a pulse time disturbance you can add here, which will multiply one terrorist incident by like 10 or 100. So you're saying there's one attack that really kills more people than we expect. And how this moves through the system through the red is it actually creates a discrepancy between what we sort of expect as a normal rate of terrorism versus what we're now seeing. The discrepancy provokes a desired change in policy, which manifests as just a policy response to terrorism. And these are super aggregate numbers, 0 to 1, right? It's all normalized around a very simple scale. That policy response is, the model is then set to say how much of it is domestic versus foreign. And then within domestic, how much is focused on online and offline. So this is a sort of prioritization matrix that you set up once. That means policy choices are endogenously reflected in the model, but they will never change because of the model. It's sort of a static. You put a policy in once. The other factors is the credibility with which you deploy the response. So perceived credibility exists for both domestic and foreign response, and it goes on a scale of 0 to 1. 0 is you do everything right. It's all above board. It's perceived as very fair, very credible, very legitimate. It doesn't provoke suffering. 1 means you're waterboarding, you're rendition, you're doing drone strikes that kill families, you're doing all the horrible things, and it's creating a lot of suffering. It's not perceived as a very credible reaction. So you can set those, and these are the some of the ways you differ the starting instances. This loop then completes that the pool will change in its number based off the perceived near suffering. So more people may join the self-similar pools as they get exposed to that moral outrage. And here at the bottom are just 3 simple charts that show equilibrium and then the base case. And the base case is at time 10, there's a multiplier by 10 for a pulse. And then it's a 50-50 split. 50% go foreign, 50% response is domestic, and within offline and online, there's a 50% response there. And you see here that there's a pulse of the radicalized individuals creates this discrepancy perception, which then recedes over time. But it actually, the problem is that the reactions create negative feedback, a reinforcing vicious loop, and your radicalized individuals actually increases and settles at a much higher equilibrium than where you started at. So this is just one potential manifestation of the system. And you see here, these are the suffering levels, right? Perceived near suffering, perceived, and the policies and response. You can see that increase and decrease. The rate of mobilization is looking at 2 factors, the online gain and the offline gain. These are your social networks, these are your internets. The offline social is a very simple mass diffusion, a contact rate by a fruitfulness, very aggregate. And then the online is actually a combination of foreign online content created overseas that conveys far suffering, but has a higher quality because the foreign terrorist organization has a dedicated information office. And to do that, to produce that content, they have to have a safe haven. So there's a safe haven value from 0 to 1. If you have a 1 safe haven, it multiplies at 1. If you have 0, it multiplies at 0, it wipes it out. So it's a very simple way of describing that you have an area in which you can conduct these operations. Now, a safe haven may be an entire country, like Afghanistan after 9/11. It may be a region, like the cross-tribal area, Pakistan and Afghanistan. It may be an active war zone, like Syria, but no one's getting to you like ISIS was. The other part of online content is this sort of local near content that's created by the locals. A key feedback loop, however, is this stock. This is a memory of the perception of a local individual's perception of personal grievance. It is fed by an increase in near suffering and is forgotten over time. So if you stop the near suffering, reduce the policy, it will fade away. But this adds as a positive reinforcing to both their offline and online radicalization. If you have experienced personal grievance yourself, you are much more likely to see it and recognize it in other situations. Whereas you may, if you haven't experienced it yourself, you may see it in like a news story of an unarmed black man being shot. I might say that's a bad thing, but I haven't experienced myself. Law enforcement, it doesn't have the same resonance.
Sorry, I don't see the positive feedback loop that you're talking about. How does grievance eventually add to the increase of
Sure. So
resonance?
Perceived near suffering is right here in the loop, right? So if you think about these are the people, it comes here and it increases perceived near suffering, which then adds to the local grievance, then increases radicalization, and radicalization is the rate at which these folks increase. So that will be the positive feedback. And again, these are some basic charts that show the rate of radicalization after the first terrorist attack that was high. There's actually a policy response that reduces the radicalization. But what's happening is over time, there's an accumulation of personal grievance that is actually wasn't there before. So you have a rate of radicalization that's actually higher than when you started because you're perceived as being uncredible. And that's what creates this sort of new higher equilibrium levels of radicalized individuals. Now there are limits, there's a demographic limit, there's other limits that are built into this. So this can't raise forever, but these radicalized individuals can go from 0 to several thousand. So, this isn't the worst case scenario I saw in all the simulations I ran, but you can see it's got an effect you don't want. You had a policy response, you ended up with more radicals who are going to commit more terrorism, and you didn't sort of help yourself. The offline and online network sector, it is a very, very simple carrying capacity structure. This one up here is a renewal carrying capacity. So as you reduce online networks, because it's the internet, it's very easy to reconstitute. You build another website, you build another web forum, you go to a different Twitter account. So basically, there's a desired level, and even if you reduce this, it will quickly go back up to where it needs to be. Offline networks, however, are a regeneration carrying capacity. So there's a nucleus of offline social groups that if you manage to get below that nucleus, they're not going to regenerate back, or they at least won't do so very quickly. And this means that under certain circumstances, you can eliminate all the offline radical networks. And if you don't have any offline radical networks, you're not going to be exposed to any. There's no soccer groups. There's no petty criminal gangs. The final sector looks at the overseas, at the safe haven and conflict zone. So it's got a simple prevalence of safe haven, goes from 0 to 1. And very simply, if you do a foreign response, they'll lose the safe haven. You can see here where it loses the safe haven very quickly. However, the local radicals in the foreign terrorist organization, this would be like core al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. It starts with a certain number if you activate it. But it can be joined by accidental guerrillas that are activated because you did a foreign intervention that provoked an insurgency or response. You came in heavy, and all of a sudden these accidental guerrillas are locals who would not fight you, but you're there, and you're in your space, and you're kind of violating their norms. So they activate into becoming accidental guerrillas, and a percentage of them become radicals in the terrorist organization. Likewise, and all of this is driven off perceived far suffering. So if you have a highly credible intervention, theoretically, you don't provoke accidental terror. You might be working with local groups, you might have a very low footprint, you might be doing law enforcement, or your drone strikes never hit the wrong person kind of stuff. As you have far suffering, though, you also have foreign fighters will begin to expatriate the radicals, and the foreign fighters join the foreign terrorist organization. This activates the Mujahideen films, which adds another effect, another feedback effect, and in a certain amount of time, they will return to the homeland. So you can see here, you didn't have any foreign fighters, but when you did this massive intervention that shut down the safe haven, a bunch of people went overseas to join them, and they're going to be coming back over this rate. Whereas this shows the accidental guerrilla effect. You have the local terrorists that were hardcore, but then the accidental spikes way up. And even though you eliminated the safe haven for the terrorists, when you left, there was this much higher level of insurgent conflict. You kind of left a failed state in your wake. And so those are the 4 sectors of the model. There's only 4 sectors in it. It's not perfectly simple, but I tried to keep it fairly simple. These are very crude state space maps. I wanted to identify the system shifting between the swarm and the fisherman state. So unfortunately, Benson does not have a good capacity here. But imagine this y-axis is saying the percentage of the threat that comes from offline. If it's 0.5 or higher, the majority of the threat comes from an offline, a local offline, local kids, local radicalization, local sources. So at 1, on the y-axis, 100% of your offline networks are locally based. At 0, 100% of your offline networks are foreign based. You got foreign actors are helping it. So right here, you can have one y-axis that determines where the threat for offline radicalization is generated, and the x-axis is where the threat for online radicalization is generated. So 5 or higher means it's local people creating local web content, chatting in chat rooms. Below 5 means it's foreign terrorist organizations presenting web content. And these are continuums. It's not one or the other. Because the way the system is started, it will always start in the swarm space. It will always start in this red corner. And then if you imagine there are 4 quadrants here, right? You put a dividing line in at the 0.5 mark. The upper right quadrant is the swarm state. That means both online and offline terrorist threats are generated by local conditions. The bottom left quadrant is a fisherman state. Everything's being generated by overseas terrorists. And then you have this one over here that's a mix, and the lower right's a mix. So what I see here is I did 50 cases with different disturbances, pulses, starting conditions, and policy responses, and it shows the system. Here it transitions from swarm to fisherman and stays in fisherman. Here's it goes through this very dramatic transformation where it goes down into fisherman, it gets almost a very hardcore fisherman, and then generally over time builds back up and ends up as a swarm. This one has a much sharper, heads to fisherman and back to swarm. So what these system state maps are showing is they're not showing the number of radicalized individuals. That's actually something that was pointed out in the defense. And if you look in the paper, these are accompanied with, oh, you won't see it, I'm not sharing the screen, never mind. These are accompanied with counts of radicals. So you can see, hey, this policy created much more radicals and generated a fisherman response. But what these things are simply showing is that the system not only can generate both types of behavior, but it can move between under certain conditions. And unfortunately, those graphs are just not that good. So you kind of got to imagine it. The best policy was case 49. So this initial conditions was there's a persistent terrorist threat from DT0 with a delayed catastrophic. So a catastrophic terrorist attack is where I took the pulse and modified it by 100. And this was an attack at time 30. This was designed to be kind of like 9/11. Al-Qaeda had existed, and then there was a catastrophic single event. However, the policy response was evenly split foreign and domestic, and the domestic response was evenly split between offline and offline. However, unlike our response necessarily, the perceived credibility of all the options was at the best possible. It's a hypothetical best case of we did everything appropriately according to law, we didn't have any splashover effects, we had a very high perceived credibility. And what's interesting is that you can see here the radicalized individuals, most cases, there's a lot of behaviors. There's some like this that goes up and creates an equilibrium. There are ups that go up and down and revert to the mean of where it started. There are some that do a little oscillations. This one actually raises a little bit and then ends into a nice, long, steady decline below the normal level that existed prior to the attack. And the reason why is because the discrepancy after a catastrophic event is so high, the demand for action is so high, there's a large policy response. And at least in this case, hypothetically, the policy response is as ideal as possible. So that, in our case, the policy response resulted in us invading Afghanistan, later invading Iraq. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happened that would probably be perceived as not being a good idea necessarily. But in this case, maybe it wasn't invading Iraq, it was just sending special forces team to work with locals. It might have been a lot more policing and law enforcement, it might have been a lot more engagement. But what you get here in the best case is you actually get a scenario in which you can decrease the radicals dramatically over time. And you can see what happened is that large policy response actually took out the offline networks. You can see the offline network here drops beneath its regeneration rate and stays down. So it's out of the discussion. There is no offline radicalization in this scenario after a certain point because you've eliminated it. Now, the internet renews itself, so it kind of maintains a persistent ability to generate threat. But because you've decreased the offline network so much, there's nothing to reconstitute from. Likewise, you had 500 terrorists in the overseas terrorist organization, but as you reduce the safe haven and you didn't provoke accidental guerrillas, they go down. They don't come back up. There's no you see there's zero accidental guerrillas, so there's no sort of splashover effect here. The perception of local grievance, it's actually hard to see. The case 49 is the red line at the bottom here. It generates no local personal grievance or no resonance, whereas the base case had this accumulated personal resonance that was multiplying the effect. It's not that there's no radicals in this case. There still are, but there's not that multiplier of personal resonance that I had an experience that resonates with me, so now I'm going to join them. And because of these conditions, some of which are very arbitrary and sort of hypothetical, you have a scenario where your radicals, you actually have a better than beginning starting position. And the paper goes through a lot more cases, but the key findings in the 2 weeks I had to do this was that the swarm and fisherman hypothesis are not mutually exclusive theories. What Hoffman and Sageman were doing were describing different states of the same system. And historical data proves that. At least I think it does. It makes a good case for it. That the US historical case supports a swarm hypothesis, while Western Europe supports a fisherman hypothesis. And the system can shift between these different states based off contingencies and sort of responses. And it's a combination of the scope of how much you respond. Like if you just didn't respond at all, if you ignored it, the model would go back to normal, right? Kind of hard to ignore. But it's not just the scope, but the perceived credibility of the response that generates these dynamics. And the primary drivers of radicalization are this perceived grievance generated by policy responses. There's an obvious one that if you have a foreign terrorist organization, you're 100% domestic focused, you're going to miss what's generating the threat. But overwhelmingly in almost all the models, what drove the dynamic was the near and far suffering inadvertently caused or intentionally caused by policy response that fueled this sort of second and third wave of radicalizations. And those are my key findings. That's where I end. So questions, feedback, suggestions of where to take it?
So how are you going to validate these models? Have you tried to contact original authors? I mean, Hoffman and Sageman.
That's a good idea. I didn't even think about sending this to them to get their. They both seem somewhat particular in their correspondence with one another that's published. So I don't know if I want to jump into that hornet's nest. But that's because you did that with Katusian. You sent the model to Katusian.
Yeah. So I suggest that you first you separate these models because that might generate, you know, kind of how to say that. Yes, exactly. So I recommend that you create the model for each individual hypothesis and send them to the original author separately and ask them for feedback, see if they agree with this translation or not. Because if you remember when John Sterman translated Kuhn's theory, then his student actually came out and said that, you know, it was not a good translation. Mm-hmm. So there's always this kind of danger that you develop a model and, you know, publish something, and then they come and say that, okay, this is not our hypothesis. So I think then you can have actually 3 papers, right? One is translation of Sageman's hypothesis, another is for Hoffman's hypothesis, and then you can write your 3rd paper, which would be comparing these 2, because then you have validation, right? Then they cannot say this is not our hypothesis. They already kind of endorse it.
So we don't upload this video to YouTube.
Exactly.
That's my recommendation.
So I think you need to get their approval before, you know.
As someone who's done this, Saeed, Sageman has like a gazillion potential causes and things in there. When you talk about replicating his model, should I replicate that he can find every cause that he mentioned in his book in there, because there's like 30, or simply try to aggregate them?
It's actually impossible. So that was the case also for Katusian's theory. He talked about everything in his books, but it is virtually impossible to include everything. So, but if you have a good aggregation of, you know, major relationships or, you know, significant impacts, and then your model, if your model also replicates his kind of reference modes, his mental reference modes, then you will be fine, I think. And then you can get feedback, right? I mean, you can you should just start with the simplest you know, possible model and send it to him and see what he says. If he agrees, then you will be fine. If not, he will tell you that, okay, X and Y and Z are missing from your model, so then you can actually add those things. So that is one approach that I can think of. Maybe you have some better ideas. I don't know.
That's very good feedback.
Yeah. And but it was a very, very interesting work. I think this is a great work. So so you should just keep up this and continue. But it takes time. You should be patient.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take a breather after 2 weeks on this.
Yeah.
Around in the head a little bit.
Yeah.
Igor, Rafat, any thoughts?
That's huge.
Thanks.
What you did in 2 to 3 weeks. doing this, pulling off a theory from scratch and
Yeah.
resolving the debate. That's big. So I think it's going to be a work of impact if you pursue it diligently in order to, as Saeed suggested, get the validation and do the proper aggregation that also get them to understand your work. Because, I mean, the point, if they refuse your interpretation of their hypothesis, not necessarily could be because of an issue in modeling, but rather maybe understanding. So how to manage this, that we can relate to what you're writing about. That's I think that's a skill to be learned and capability to be acquired, and I think you're on the way. So
good feedback, Igor.
Well, thank you. What I really liked was the way you presented the archetypes, and that really helped me understand the structure very fast. So, well, the 2 points that I would, well, there's one thing is that you know, since the beginning, I was sure that what you would present would be a summary model that would be actually a sum of the two models, and I was sure of that because I wasn't because I realized that maybe these two authors weren't really modeling the same phenomenon. So the only answer, like the only summarized model, would be a sum of the two. So one question that came to my mind is are they really modeling the same phenomenon, or are they modeling two different phenomena? So that's one question that came to my mind. And at another point, I also had this question about is an affiliated radical the same, like stating that a person is affiliated, is it the same as stating that this person came from a top-down process of radicalization? So these were the two conceptual points that generated some doubt in the beginning, but well, throughout the presentation, I understood your point clearly, and it was really great to see your findings in the end.
No, that's great feedback, because the affiliation marker is something that GTD does, that they have criteria and they do, and it's sort of independent. So I can say, hey, this is a third-party credible source, but they weren't answering the question, to your point, of whether this affiliation really, in their mind, like if I went to GTD and said, does affiliation in your mind correspond with fisherman? They go, oh no, it means something different. Well, then I'm using the wrong piece of data to track that. So that's a great question to go. I think to expand on what Saeed said, I got to go to Sageman and say, is this what you mean? I got to go to Hoffman and say what you mean. And then I got to go to GTD and say, when you say affiliated, do you really mean top down? Or do you mean something else when you use that? And I think that's a really good point about it could be the sum of the two models, that they're modeling different phenomena. They seem to think they're arguing the same thing. But they may not realize what they're actually arguing about is a valid point. They were both very passionately arguing sort of that they're both trying to understand radicalization. But as you're talking about it, it could be that you're right, there are these two different phenomena going on that exist side by side, and all my model's done is combine the two things into one. Which would then, the system states would be more of a prevalence of what it is at the current point in time rather than a fundamental structure type issue. Interesting. Good feedback. Great feedback.
So, thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the great feedback. I'm going to go home and sleep for a week.
And also, you shouldn't talk for a week.
Yeah, my voice is going to sound like Kermit the Frog on video or something. Yeah.
Tim is fluent with sign language, so
Yeah.
we are not, though.
All right, so thank you very much. I'm going to stop.
Take care. Bye-bye.